Agree to. Member for Butler.
Madam Acting Speaker, I rise in support of the motion, and of course you called me as the member for Butler, quite rightly, Madam Acting Speaker, and I wish to remind the House where Butler is. It is on the northern coastal extremity of Perth. I've heard other members speak of the challenges that public transport present in their areas, but the land from really Butler through the locality of Jindalee and Brighton right up to Yanchep is, if I may use the colloquial language, virgin country as far as residential dwellings go. It was only, I believe, about during my second term of representing the area, no, it must have been 2007, that I lobbied the then Premier Gallop to approve the extension of Marmion Avenue. It was ahead of the government schedule for extending Marmion Avenue through to Yanchep. There'd been bushfires at Yanchep, and the only way out of Yanchep was down Old Yanchep Beach Road and then via Wanneroo Road. There was no alternate route out there. The planning department opposed, the bureaucrats in the planning department opposed the extension of Marmion Avenue because of the challenges that having this northern coastal road going from then Brighton right through to Yanchep would then create a demand for services, which would be a challenge for government. And it is. But there was no getting around the fact that back in 2007, with the boom well and truly underway, the demand for affordable housing was unstoppable, and a lot of those people wanted to live in a coastal locality. And so now we have the sort of chant in my electorate, a new street a day, a new street a day. And I think that that chant is a little bit unrealistic because it's probably more like 2 or 3 streets a day. For those members who haven't travelled to Yanchep recently, it will be an eye-opener for them should they drive from Butler proper, from Quinns through to Yanchep, and see the enormous development in what I said was virgin agricultural country only a few years ago. All of these people, of course, most of these people are families establishing family homes in that area. It's not like inner city built up areas where you've got a lot of single people living close to educational facilities or the city. They're establishing family homes. A lot of them, now let me explain some of the challenges that are out there. If we look at Yanchep for a moment, Yanchep is serviced by bus routes 490 and 491 that go to Yanchep, and 491 is now scheduled to turn right at the roundabout in Yanchep and go out to the end of the golf course estate near the Yanchep National Park. In Yanchep there is a junior high school, and all children at that high school have to travel at some point down to one of the senior high schools at the southern extremity of my electorate, being at the Mindari Senior High School or the New Butler College, Ira McCormack Catholic College or the Elkimos Baptist College. These children have to travel by public transport. The problem is there's not enough buses, and what we're finding is that when schools at the very southern end of the electorate, be it the Peter Moyes Anglican School, which just sits on the other side of the road of the boundary, the Mindarie Senior College, which is just in my electorate of Butler, the Quinns Baptist College, which is now a huge school. When the bus goes to those schools, it fills up. And by the time it gets up to Butler Senior High and its adjacent private school, Ira McCormack Catholic College, there's not enough room on these buses for all of the children. So the complaints I'm getting from the parents, and there can be an hour between buses, is that children in years 7 and 8 are getting left behind on Marmion Avenue to wait up to an hour for another bus to get home because there has been insufficient buses provided. Now, the Department of Transport and Response says, well, we're trying to gauge the passengers' numbers for full buses. That's not good enough for children who can't get on the bus to say they didn't fit within the average numbers, so therefore they get left behind. What makes it worse is I can't find a bus shelter in the area. So not only are these children being left behind, they're being left behind in the elements. And the parents at the other end of the electorate, 15, 20 kilometres away, worried sick about their children, have then got to tear themselves away from their work or their family commitments up in Yanchep to rush down Marmion Avenue to try and get their children to school, home from school, or conversely have to drop them off on the morning to school. Why is there the demand to go south for education? Is because the Yanchep High School, junior high school, is hopelessly overcrowded, opened 37 years ago, and I've said this before in this Parliament. Built for 350 people, now housing 900 students. The government promised a $10.5 million upgrade to bring it up to some sort of standard by adding 2 science rooms. Whoop-de-doo. Most schools have got science rooms, and a tech drawing room, and a design room, and a staff room. And having promised this, not as part of the election promise, announced it in December as part of the government's program, then silently cut this without an announcement in May of this year. So the parents know that if they want to give their children a chance of getting into a high school with facilities, they've got to get their children down south as early in their educational career as possible. This requires public transport, and it's insufficient. It's insufficient. It goes beyond children, though, because when we turn to the area, one of the big attractions in the area is the Yanchep National Park, which attracts tens of thousands of people. There is small businesses involved in that national park. They can't get a bus. You can't get a bus to the Yanchep National Park. The 491 is proposed to go almost to the national park along Old Yanchep Beach Road, but they will not take it to the national park. It would do a lot for small business, and I've been speaking to one of those small business women who attends the functions here, the tourism functions, Miss Sue Dash, and she has been campaigning for a long while to get the bus to run to the Yanchep National Park. It doesn't have to go every bus. It could be just 1 or 2 a day and more on the weekends. They divert the 481 on the weekends, coming up Marmion Avenue into the private marina of Mindarie, but the 491 up at the top of my electorate, they won't go the extra kilometre to the extra kilometre half to the Yanchep National Park. Mrs Sue Dash also is instrumental in getting TRIAC going, which is a cancer support group. And one of the things that is bedeviling us up there is public transport to health services. It's insufficient. They're trying to raise money, TRIAC is trying to raise money to try and get a Toyota Hi-Ace bus or something like that to be able to get patients down to the hospitals. But there should be sufficient public transport in this area or at least on a par with other areas in Perth. But because this is on the northern extremity, the government and the Transport department ignore it. Yes, there was a promise held out in the 2011 Public Transport Review that we've discussed earlier in the Parliament today, that there would be rail to Yanchep by 2020. And now after the election, we're told that the government will review the situation of putting rail along this northern corridor past Butler in 2023. I was at the Two Rocks Yanchep Residents Association meeting earlier this week with Peter Wimsett. Well, Mr Wimsett, the president, was absent. It had to be an apology, but it was chaired by Debbie Lenario and Lorraine Jackson, the president, and Janet Clutterbuck, the treasurer, and they say they have been writing to the Department of Transport over the bus issue without response, ignored. And now they've known, and I've explained to them, and I've shown the press releases, that the government has completely backflipped on their promise made in the 2011 Public Transport Review to get rail up there by 2020, saying they'll review that situation in 2023. What a disgrace. What a disgrace. Whilst on rail, we had a debate earlier this afternoon on rail, and during that, the Premier did pay me the courtesy of saying there's only been one person in the opposition who's approached me on public transport into his electorate, and that was the member for Butler, John Quigley, and he strongly argued the case to me that I'll have to reverse my decision, because remember in 2008 after the election, one of the government's first decisions was to cancel the rail extension to Butler. And the Premier at least paid me the courtesy this afternoon in this chamber of acknowledging that it was my representations to him and my deputations to him on behalf of my local residents that changed his mind and got the rail extension through to Butler. But when it was said in this chamber that they've built 8 kilometres in 6 years, 5 or 6 years, that was slightly wrong. That was slightly wrong. That was overstating the case, Madam Acting Speaker, because in fact the line, it's 8 kilometres from the Clarkson station to what is said to be the new Butler station, but 2 kilometres of that had already been built because that's up to the Nowagup yards. Well, only so the government come back and say, I'm misleading, it was only a single line, they had to build another line. All the earthworks were done, all the electrics were there, so now the government is arguing, the interjection by the member for Ocean Reef is that fair go on the government, you're trying to mark us down from 8 kilometres to 6 kilometres, they're quibbling over 2 kilometres, glory be. Glory be. The Labor government in the same time built 80 to 90 kilometres of track all the way to Mandurah, and could I remind the member for Ocean Reef, 2 tracks we built. One, we got the train down there and we can get the train back. 2 tracks. We're not going to quibble. And not only that, tunnelled under the city. And at the time that the Labor government said we're going to tunnel under the city and make this city a modern city, what did the Liberal government say? You're going to, like Henny Penny, the sky's going to fall in. You've got all these stabilising cables under these skyscrapers, and when you dopey Labor people build a tunnel under the city, like Henny Penny saying, oh, the sky's going to fall in, they were saying all the buildings are going to fall in on William Street. Now, so, look, I don't want to enter into a debate with the member for Ocean Reef who's trying to defend me against the charge that they've only built 6 kilometres in 6 years by saying, oh no, we've actually built a little bit more than 6 kilometres. Whoop-de-doo. if we had have been going at the rate of 1 kilometre a year down to Mandurah, like the Liberal government are going in the northern, and on the northern line, Madam Acting Speaker, just think about it, rail would have been completed in Mandurah, rail would have got to Mandurah in 2091. That's the rate they're going at. To give you a comparison, it would have taken them nearly a century to get to Mandurah at the rate that they build rail. But it's worse than that, Madam Acting Speaker. They also did, as I've said before in this chamber, they played a 3-card trick. But it hasn't fooled the people of Shorehaven and Amberton and these suburbs to the north of Butler, or the people of Butler. The 3-card trick they pulled is that Labor had completed the plans for the extension through to Brighton Jindalee locality. They had, and part of those plans, and they had acquired, Madam Acting Speaker, the PTA had acquired land at the top of Lucan Drive, where all the schooling precinct is in the electorate, close to all the retirement villages, and where the subdivisions had been subdivided into small lots to be adjacent to a train station to be called the Butler train station at the top of Lucan Drive. The government there had some good hectares of land to build a huge car park to cater for the huge population in this area. Now the Premier did listen to me, and I've got to acknowledge that, and he's acknowledged the representations I made on behalf of my electorate to get this line extended. But there was a little bit of trickery going on, but I don't say the Premier was involved in the trickery, because could I seek an extension please, Madam Acting Speaker? Because I don't believe the Premier had been into the electorate of Butler, and so when they said we're building the line to the Butler station, I don't believe that the Premier was cognisant of the fact that the Butler station had been designed at Lucan Drive, and at the shopping precinct in Brighton there was to be a walk-on, walk-off station like at Edgewater in Joondalup. Not a great big station with car parks all around it. And so what they did, what the Department of Transport, and I don't believe the Premier knew that. I think that the Premier sincerely believes that when he's saying we're doing we're going to put the Butler line in, I don't think that he comprehends what he's done. They've cancelled the Butler station and rebadged Brighton as Butler. The significance of this is that PTA own no land for car parks at Brighton, because that was designed as a walk-on, walk-off station where buses would terminate and go to. So what have they done? They have leased land off the Satterley Corporation for 10 years to provide car parks. Not a lot of land for car parks. Now, I was speaking with the members and the committee of the Alkimos Progress Association, who are led by two people I've got to take my hat off to. They're at every meeting in the area, and they're really concerned. They're a young family, really concerned about the area, and that is Hayden Morgan and his wife Tracy. Hayden he's got his birthday today. I believe he turns 35 today, so I'll give him a little happy birthday here from my seat in Parliament. But as he was pointing out, what happens in 10 years' time? What happens in 10 years' time when the lease runs out with Satterley? That land's worth a poultice. That land has to revert to the developer. There's no car park. And there's no rail extension up to Alkimos where there could be a new car park, because the government say they will only look at further extensions north after 2023. There won't be the only perhaps two members of the Liberal Party that'll still be in Parliament the member for Ocean Reef, because possibly, no, well, he's on a pretty safe margin there in Ocean Reef, and possibly, well, she'll still be alive at least, the member for Perth. But by 2023, the rest of them will all be fossils, No one will remember all this. This will be all ancient history. But I don't think the member for Perth is in a very invidious situation, as she knows that she's sitting on a very rickety chair in view of what's happened to the betrayal of her electorate over the Max Light Rail. But what we've got out there, as I've said, is that, and as the Alkimos Progress Association has pointed out to me this week, before I knew this motion was coming up, the buses going up and down Marmion Avenue don't turn left or right into the developments, so that children going to school have to wait out on Marmion Avenue for the bus, which could be 40 minutes, which could be up to 40 minutes. And I heard the member for Gosnell saying that there's not enough bus shelters in his area. Well, heavens to Betsy, I'm not criticising my Labor Party colleague, the member for Gosnells, but you see, these people have no idea. I don't blame them because they're busy in their own electorates, but at least in Gosnells and in Perth and in other areas, there's a shop, a tree, somewhere for the children to shelter in inclement weather. Somewhere. But if you think of the country, the coastal plain, it's only low heath shrubbery. And so that when you're waiting on the side of Marmion Avenue, well, as the people of the member for Ocean Reef's electorate refer to it, because I used to represent Mindarie, they call it Windari, because of the very bright sea breeze that hits there every afternoon, a very bright sea breeze. And these children have to, without protection from the elements, wait on the side of Marmion Avenue. Now, I wrote to the Transport Department about this on behalf of the Alkimos Progress Association, and was met with the response, well, there's insufficient passenger numbers to justify us putting in a bus shelter in your electorate. We've got other priorities. But who should this Parliament, who should we, as a, well, I was going to say we as a government, I'm not part of it, but who should the government be first protecting? The elderly and the children. Perhaps, you know, a codger like me could stand out in the elements and hold a briefcase above my head for 20 minutes in inclement weather. But we've got children trying to get to school having to stand by the road without a bus shelter. It's insufferable. There's got to be a bus shelter in Trinity. There's got to be a one on either side of the road. There's got to be a bus shelter on either side of the road, Shorehaven. And there's got to be one at Amberton. Let me tell you about Amberton. Amberton is just exploding as a suburb, but they weren't warned that they're not on deep sewerage. They weren't warned that the government had done a deal with the developers where they would truck the sewage out on a regular basis from a holding tank, and they weren't warned that these contractors who use these big suction pipes to empty the tank and put it on the sewage carts to truck down to another depot would just leave their hose pipes on the side of the verge with the smell of the sewage, the flies that gather. This is in a brand new estate.
Who did that deal?
Sorry?
Who did that deal?
The developers and the government.
With who in government?
I don't know, and I don't know when. I'm not sort of pointing the finger here. I'm saying that is the situation they're in at the moment. They're not interested. They're not interested in whether it was you, Minister, or your Labor predecessor. They're not interested in that. All as they're interested in is, can they... I mean, it's that this tank overflows over Christmas that overflows, and we had raw sewage in the park. It's dreadful. Dreadful. And you've got your family and friends coming up for Christmas and you're on the nose. It is just absolutely awful, and there's no end in sight to it. There is no end in sight to it. But look, I'm not here to talk about the sewage problems in Amberton at the moment. I'd just be satisfied, just today, if I could squeeze out of this speech, if I'm up to my best, I've managed to persuade the Premier to extend the rail line from Clarkson to Butler, as he graciously acknowledged today in the Parliament. I'd hope that I'm in form, and by reason of this speech could persuade the government to give us about 6 to 8 bus shelters out there. That's not going to break the bank. They could just pull up only 2 of those shark lines and we'd have the money for a half a dozen bus shelters out there. The other places that need bus shelters out there are outside of the Raffa Retirement Village and Cambrai Retirement Villages in Merriwa. Now, I've worked very cooperatively with Mayor Tracy Roberts, and we've visited these villages, and there isn't a bus stop outside of there on Hester Avenue. And what the elderly folk of the village said is if the bus could just continue up, instead of turning into Amberton, could just continue up Hester, only for, this is not going to break the bank, Madam Acting Speaker, so I hope I don't get caned by the government for this suggestion, only for a kilometre, and then turn around the roundabout and then come back west along Hester Avenue. This would provide a bus service for the elderly in the retirement villages. The response was, no, there's one out the back of the village in Amberton, and they can walk out through a back gate and hike with their shopping out through this back gate along this problematic path to a bus stop, of course, where there's no bus shelter. Now, I thought that their request, and so did Mayor Tracy Roberts, think that their request for the bus first to go past the retirement village, around the roundabout, and then come back and turn right was very, very moderate and reasonable request. A very moderate and reasonable request. So, in conclusion, the population explosion in my electorate does present big challenges for any government, be it a Liberal government or a Labor government, in supplying infrastructure out there. But it is not lost on my electorate, that whilst they are denied the most basic services, that is, the extension of, not of every bus, but the extension of Route 491 into the Yanchep National Park to promote tourism in the Yanchep National Park, to help small business and to provide community amenity in the national park. It's not a big expense, but then they look south. Whoop-de-doo, what do they see? Promises of a $2 billion rail line to the airport to hold the seat of Forestfield, the marginal seat of Forestfield. Another couple of billion running down through the inner north metropolitan seats of Mount Lawley and Perth to hold those seats for Max Light Rail. And what are we asking for? An extension of 491, some more buses on routes 490 and 491 to accommodate all of the school children of a morning and afternoon. 6 to 8 bus shelters. 6 to 8 bus shelters. I mean to say, they talk about building the football stadium for $500 million or more at Burswood. I think it's probably north of that, 800 million or something. People in my area won't be able to get there. There's a lot of kids in that would like to go to the football. They won't be able to get there because of the paucity of public transport. I'm pleading with this government on behalf of the residents of my area, especially on behalf of the Two Rocks Yanship Residents Association and the Alkimos Progress Association, for this government to at least pay a little bit of attention to what's happening in the north. Finally, if I can just put an advertorial in, that on Saturday morning at 8 o'clock there's going to be a big rally down at Shorehaven Beach promoted by Alkimos ratepayers
Time,
protesting
member.
against
The
motorbikes
question
in the
is
sandhills.
that the motion be agreed.